Okay. What other things have you got up here? Surgeon General. Who's the Surgeon General of the question? Go ahead.
It was the overweight woman.
The overweight woman. Okay, that narrows it down. What was her name?
I forgot, but she was in charge of national health.
Surgeon General, the government spokesperson on health issues. Who was she?
Regina Benjamin.
Regina Benjamin. And what was the issue?
She was promoting healthy lifestyle, but she was obese.
As the Surgeon General of the United States, you're going to be the government mouthpiece on health issues. And what's the #1 health issue in the United States? Obesity. And one of the smaller articles on that page actually says, what does it cost on average a year?
$2 trillion.
$2 trillion. And this is not just dealing with obesity, but it's dealing with other diseases that maybe it perpetuates, things of this sort. She is actually, according to her critics anyway, she's representing the very issue, the #1 health issue in the country that she's supposed to be fighting. And the argument, or what was the discussion that we had? What's the danger about having somebody that is government defined as obese attempting to fight obesity? Go ahead.
You're basically a representation of what you're trying to prevent or what you're trying to get rid of.
And would that message hold water? No, the argument is that if you're representing something that is the problem, meaning you can't fight it, then why would other people listen? What were her qualifications? Do y'all recall?
I don't remember. I just remember she was highly educated and she fit the position.
Highly educated. She was somebody that was accepted to the American Medical Association as the youngest woman, I believe, and the first black female member, if I'm not mistaken, made house calls in rural Alabama. Excellent doctor. And the question that came about is, what do you do about this? I mean, is her message going to hold sway, or in fact, is she going to kind of undo the message? It mentions a little bit later on in the article the idea of maybe she should lose weight in office to model what she's doing, which might be a good idea because we talked about Oprah and how weight went up and down when Oprah's weight went up or down, but it also makes her a little bit of a sideshow when she does this. Go ahead, Gabs.
What was her name again?
Regina Benjamin. Regina Benjamin. Any other questions or thoughts about the articles? Go ahead, Ian.
Do we go through body cameras again?
I think I'm going to not do anything with
Okay,
body
that's great.
cameras.
Let's see about that.
I think I'm not going to do anything with body cameras, if that's okay.
That's fine.
It sounds like it is.
Yeah.
Let's go to chapter, actually, wait, let's go back to the links real quick on this. Bear with me, I'm sorry about that. Let's go back to the links real quick and just make sure. When I write up the exam, I'm probably going to put articles and links in the same place because there are fewer articles this time, but man, there are some links. Remember the Georgia sex offender law, naked man drinking coffee? You remember those? Actually, let me go back to chapter 5 because that's probably where we just left. I should go back to. But the links in chapter 5, blah, 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 blah. Wait, I did it again.
Wait, did the links are they also articles as well?
I said that I'm going to link the articles and the links together. So there's Biden and Articulate, there's Seinfeld and the Native Americans, Tiger Fuzzy and the Collard Greens, Iverson and Paul, and then, of course, the 15th Amendment. What was the key with the 15th Amendment? Go ahead, Ian.
It was after they established you can't discriminate based on race, but they established poll taxes and voting tests to work around it.
What was the 15th Amendment designed to protect? Because you said discriminate. Discriminate how exactly? Because the 13th Amendment ended slavery. What did the 15th Amendment do?
Protect against discrimination based on intrinsic traits of an individual.
But when you do what? Vote. The 15th Amendment was designed to establish voting rights. Did it say that it gave people the right to vote?
No.
It never did. It actually said, to your point, that there were 3 factors. You had the right to vote as long as it did not discriminate based on what?
Race, color, or previous condition of
Race,
servitude.
color, or previous condition of servitude. So how did these voting rights tests fit into that? Go ahead, Sean.
Wait, you said how did these voting? Oh, well, I mean, it was what I mentioned earlier. Like, I mean.
Yeah,
they
tell us
asked
about the
you
soap bubble
How
now.
many bubbles came out of a bar of soap? But
Okay, and why did that work?
I mean, because it's not about race, color, or your previous servitude. So I mean.
What's it about?
How many bubbles.
It's
are-
about being able to count how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, exactly. The jelly bean test was the same kind of thing. It wasn't based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but in fact it was based on how many jelly beans are in a jar. And did they just ban, or did they just use these tests? You're already shaking your head, go ahead.
I mean, they did it to anybody who they didn't want to vote, whether it was a African American, a woman, or somebody who was an uneducated, poor white male. So
Exactly, and in fairness, women weren't voting at this point, so let's leave them out so that nobody gets confused. But you're right, the freedmen would have been involved in this. A lot of poor whites would have been involved as well. So you had the jelly bean test, you had the soap bubble test. I believe there were 2 or 3 others, right?
Literacy test?
Poll tax. How'd poll tax work?
If you cannot pay or you lost your receipt, even if you paid the tax, you were denied the right to vote.
Yeah, they would actually make you pay a fee in order to be able to vote. And right there, that would knock off many of the freedmen. Right there, that would knock off many of the poor whites. And they would typically make you pay this like, maybe months in advance, and you would have to produce the receipt that you paid. So even if you paid but you couldn't produce the receipt, they weren't going to let you vote. And if you could never afford to pay in the first place, were you being denied on account of your race, color, or previous condition of servitude? Why are you being denied?
Because you couldn't pay the fine.
Because of your inability to be able to pay the actual tax. Go ahead.
the literacy test.
What was the literacy
It
test?
was basically just for some people, if they wanted you to vote, they'd give you like the little train that could or something like that.
Something very, very easy.
Yeah, and then if you were I guess somebody who they didn't want to vote, they'd give you like a college textbook of some reading that looks very hard.
Give you a law, give you a constitution, something like this. Or in later years, they would give you a series of questions that maybe were based on, for example, the Constitution. And we talked about how they were very selective in their application. A funny thing, a lot of the people that were overseeing the poll tax, or not the poll taxes, but the literacy test, or the jelly bean test, or the soap bubble test, they didn't know the answers to the questions. But they did tell people that they were getting them wrong, and it was both the freedmen and the poor whites. What was the last one that we talked about?
Grandfather clause.
What was the grandfather clause, James?
If your grandfather could not vote before the Civil War, then you could not vote.
Yeah, and effectively, this could also not just eliminate the freedmen.
Also poor whites.
Yeah, but this would eliminate a lot of poor whites because of the old property requirements and things like this. If they would have just written the 15th Amendment saying, and all of the classes kind of had a simple amendment, all the freedmen, all the newly freedmen have the right to vote, then they wouldn't have had these issues because they specifically had the right to vote. But when you say you cannot deny somebody the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, that means that you can deny them the right to vote for other reasons, and that's the loophole that they found. Take a good look at that one too. Chapter 11, and I'll be fairly brief with this because I know we're coming up on time. But maybe there's a few more terms in this. I know there's fewer articles. Did y'all have any questions about any of the terms from chapter 11? And I'll lower this down and I'll make this bigger for Nemi.
Thanks. Maybe I should get some glasses. Yes, I can.
Anything at all?
It says one.
Go ahead, James.
Hotline.
Let's remove hotline. Yeah, let's remove hotline. Anything else?
It says
Franking.
Franking we started to address at the very end of the Eddie Murphy stuff the other day, and if I didn't get your class with it, I'll go ahead and address it now. Franking is the idea that you have free postage as a member of Congress. So you can get printing, you can get postage, any mailings. Now, these cannot be things that can be used to get reelected. They can't say, vote for me on government dime. But they can give, like, history of your votes. They can show you holding babies and those giant oversized checks. They can talk about things that you're doing in the community. They can talk about things that would make people want to vote for you, but they can't advocate specifically, vote for me. You got to pay for that on your own. And within the context of incumbency, if you remember, the idea that you have mailings, it boosts your name recognition, this helps more people know who you are. Your challenger is going to have to pay for his or her own mailings, and typically they don't have that much money, so this was another advantage. Speaking of incumbency, what were the advantages for incumbents? Go ahead.
You were in office, you were receiving a large wage for yourself. And
So you have a salary about $200,000, right? And the average person running, Ian, are they making any money at all?
No.
but probably gonna have to quit their full-time job, so that right there, many Americans can't do that. Give me some more.
If you're incumbent, you also receive staff wages as well.
Staff away, and do you remember roughly how much that was?
500,000.
In the Eddie Murphy movie, it was a little bit more than 500,000. In today's terms, it's a little bit less than $1 million. Which means if you're running, Ian, who pays for your staff if you're the challenger? You are, yeah. If you're running in the challenger, so you don't have a job because you had to give that up to run. You're paying out money that now you're not taking any in. That's going to eliminate a lot of people from possibly challenging. Well, the incumbent has got a high salary, or at least a decent salary, and campaigning is going to be part of their job responsibilities. You can kind of say technically. Their staff, they're not going to be exclusively working on the campaign, but they're going to have an organization in place. It's going to be paid for by the government. Some of their duties overlap into campaigning. Of course, you get the franking in there, which was a piece. They have free travel back and forth to their district. If you're a challenger, Ian, who pays for your travel?
Yourself.
Yourself, which again makes it all that much more difficult. Anything else that you remember advantages of incumbency?
Name recognition.
Name recognition.
Name recognition was a big one. That's how Eddie Murphy got into office, was because people recognized the name Jeff Johnson, and he changed his name a little bit so that it would be Jeff Johnson, if you recall on that. And the longer that you stay in office, the more that your name is out there, the more that people are familiar with you. Go ahead, Gabs.
I'm just trying to figure out what hotline is.
Oh, we've already removed Hotline. We did it several minutes ago, so Hotline is out.
Are you gonna email us? Sorry, are you gonna email us saying which improvement taken out?
Well, I think we've only got 3 things.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're all on tape, so I think we should be good with that. Go ahead. And the other thing was experience. The longer you're there, the better committees you get. The better committees you get, the more that you can do for the people back home. So experience, staff, money, name recognition, franking, these are all gargantuan advantages. Toby, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was gonna ask reapportionment.
What was reapportionment?
Is that every so often district lines are redrawn?
Exactly. Every 10 years, the district lines are redrawn in the aftermath of the census, and it's drawn based on population. And let me make sure that I'm clear about something, and let me make sure that I'm clear about how I'll ask this. I was going back through the chapter. The chapter says that it's basically a little bit less than 711,000 people per district. I think I've given y'all several numbers on this, some updated numbers. But for test purposes, it's just a little bit more than 700,000 people per district. And what they do is they count everybody in the census, they figure out which areas have gained people and which areas have lost people, and then effectively what they do is they redraw the lines, and the number one factor is making sure that all of the districts are about the same size, so that one person equals one vote, no matter where you are in the country. Do you remember some of the sinister problems that could happen with reapportionment? Ian, go ahead.
Gerrymandering.
And how is gerrymandering? What's the other factor that you consider when you draw a district?
I think your summary was if it looks biased, it's not allowed.
Okay, if districts look different than other districts, look noticeably different, then they're going to question that immediately. But why would you draw it so that it looks different? What's the purpose behind gerrymandering?
To include or exclude certain voting demographics,
Like what specifically?
race.
Like you wanna have like a majority of like Republicans or?
It's partisan in the beginning. Racial gerrymandering is the second part of this. Remember, Elbridge Gerry was the Massachusetts governor, and states are in charge of their redistricting or their reapportionment. So when they redraw the districts, the number one factor is supposed to be the size. The number two factor, if you're a Republican, you're probably going to want to create a few more Republican districts. If you're Democrat, you're probably going to want to create a few more Democratic districts. To your point, if you can do this, but if the districts come into odd shapes, well, that's going to raise questions that you're trying to cheat. And with Jerry, what did his district look like?
A salamander.
Looked like a salamander, hence the term gerrymandering. So if it looks suspicious or it looks very different than all of the other districts, that's going to raise questions, and you're right, it's typically based on party. You can do it based on race. Do you remember the examples that I gave you with race?
Alabama.
Alabama, what did they draw in Alabama? How big was the district?
Oh, is it like
80%.
How many sides did the district in Alabama have? They created a 28-sided voting district that went from 80% black, when it just had 4 sides, to about 90-some-odd% white.
Oh, yeah.
and they drew it so that all of the black voters or potential black voters were now outside the city limits so that they could not vote in city elections. Go ahead.
In terms of population, you said it was a little over 700,000.
Right.
What about, city urban centers with high clustered populations and rural areas with spread out populations?
They would take that, I mean, that would be something that would be easy to verify. I mean, there are gonna be smaller districts in those concentrated areas and bigger ones in the rural ones. But if you draw them in a way, and y'all started to mention the North Carolina case, where the thing looked kind of like a banana or a claw, some people said, and it didn't fit any of the other districts in the state. That's what we're talking about. So you're right. I mean, if it's something that's verifiable based on population, they're not going to strike that one down. But when there aren't those population clusters or areas, and it's still odd shaped compared to everything else, usually if it looks like it's cheating, they're going to say to themselves, we better take a look at it. For our purposes, though, racial gerrymandering. They drew a 28-sided district, and the court said anytime a district is based on race, it is immediately constitutionally suspect, and they struck it down. What was that banana district in North Carolina?
It was just the interstate, wasn't it?
Interstate. What interstate was it?
I-85.
It was known as the I-85 district, and it was drawn so narrowly that if you opened your car doors and drove up and down the road, that in fact they joked that you would hit and kill everybody in the district. What kind of a district was it? It was different somehow.
Black majority district?
Yeah, it was a minority majority district. And the idea was that they created a district so that it was majority black voters. Why did they do this in North Carolina and some other southern states? Uh-oh. They did it because they were not actually getting good black representation in Congress. They weren't getting any black representation in Congress. So the logic was that if you create a majority black district, then this district will now elect some black representatives. Makes sense, right? What was the problem when there was the lawsuit? Go ahead.
I mean, there was another black district that they created that was up higher, but it was
By the coast, that's right.
And it looked at least similar to the other districts, other than this one that you just said, like, if you drove through it, you'd hit everybody and kill them. So,
Right.
I mean, it was just the fact of the matter that they literally drew it specifically to get that demographic of people rather than, I guess, like creating an area. I mean,
How did it compare, though, to the Alabama case? Because the Alabama case said when a voting district is based on race, it's immediately constitutionally suspect, and they struck it down.
I mean,
Well, it didn't matter if you're trying to help the group out. It was still like you're excluding.
In North Carolina, they still drew the district based primarily on race, and even though it wasn't to discriminate, but in fact it was to help people get better representation, the courts struck it down anyway, and they said it was discriminatory. So it doesn't matter if you're trying to include or exclude, if you're trying to screw over or benefit. The idea, if it's based primarily on race, it's going to be immediately constitutionally suspect. To your point, Sean, that other district did not look very different than the others. They couldn't say it was based primarily on race, and as such, that one held, but the one that kind of looked like that banana or that claw was struck down several times in North Carolina. So keep that in mind. Any other questions or things? And could you push the red button?